Well, good afternoon, everyone. We have a parallel session on glass and spirituality, and I want to thank Alison and Bronwyn for inviting me to participate. And I'm going to be sharing this session and giving a paper. There will be two other speakers, Susan Kellett from Queensland, RSL Queensland, and Caroline Miley, whom we heard last night, which was very interesting. And Susan will be talking about Waller's War, Spirituality in the Hall of Memory, and Caroline will be talking about Anima Mundi in the Antipodes, Christian Waller's Spiritual Evolution. As in the other sessions, I would suggest that we ask you to put questions in the chat and that we give the papers, trying to keep to our time limit of 15 minutes. And then at the end, we have a look over the comments and the questions in the chat. Quick introduction of myself. I taught art history at La Trobe University for about 25 years. And I am particularly interested in medieval art, but I also have a great interest in the churches of Melbourne, particularly, I suppose, Catholic churches, but also Anglican churches and other churches as well. And the art in them and the stained glass windows. So I'm going to be talking about what I've called Magnificat, reflections on some stained glass windows in Melbourne churches. The Magnificat being looking at iconography, particularly connected with the Virgin Mary. Okay, to begin. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, churches in Melbourne were always built in Gothic Revival style. This style emulated the Gothic designs of in architecture, but also emulated the beautiful decoration in glass, as you can see here at Chartres and in the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. But in these medieval buildings, most of the windows were, as you see on the left, divided into small scenes, and they're quite high up, so sometimes quite difficult to see. But in the scenes of the 19th century, they're divided basically into three sections: the tracery at the top, the main field in the middle, and the base at the bottom. And this is a window from, it's made by William Montgomery, and I must acknowledge that I know most about William Montgomery from Bronwyn Hughes, who I think spoke beautifully about him. Often there was also a dedicatory inscription naming the sponsor and sometimes asking for prayers for the sponsor and his or her family. The decoration of a church or chapel could include a series of biblical narrative scenes, each expressed as a picture in glass. And sometimes the artist copied a well-known old master painting. In this paper, I shall compare and contrast the stained glass windows of the Lady Chapel of St. Francis's Church in the city of Melbourne, which were made initially in 1858 and onwards, with some of those in the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Hawthorne, made between 1870 and 1961, in terms of their place, their iconography, and their dedicatory inscriptions. Now, the Church of St. Francis's in the city was the oldest Catholic church in Melbourne and was in use by May 1842. Subsequently, a Lady Chapel was built on the west side of the nave, which you can see on the right. And that happened in 1855 to 1856, when St. Francis's Church served as the Catholic Cathedral of Melbourne before St. Francis's was built. A Franciscan friar, Father Daniel McAvee, was the chapel's founder. And on the 31st of May, 1858, Bishop James Lippius Gould blessed the structure, and the next day, the local Argus newspaper commented on what was there. It said, "The new chapel presents one of the most beautiful interiors of our city that our city can boast. It is situated on the western side of the cathedral and contains several windows, all of which are intended to be filled up with stained glass. At present, 2 large windows and an oriel, that's a round window, are so ornamented." And you can see these in the next slide, okay? These paintings respectively represent the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and the descent of the Holy Ghost. The windows were above and at either side of the altar, and not long after this, 6 more windows were inserted, 3 on either side of the chapel. The windows in the Lady Chapel were imported from John Hardman and Co. in Birmingham, England. Written sources tell us that they were originally designed by Louis Le Gould and James Souter, 2 artists from Birmingham, who were much influenced by the Gothic Revival architect Augustus Welby Pugin. In the Hardman archives in Birmingham, there are 2 letters related to the Lady Chapel windows, indicating that the firm had received from Father McAvoy in Melbourne patterns and instructions for making the 9 windows, and agreeing to make the glass with richer colors than it was at first proposed, and beginning with the first 3, as we see. The letters noted that the windows were made to Mr. Souter's design, not ours. And Mr. Souter comes up again occasionally in the design of windows in Melbourne. In 1996, Caroline Miley, who's one of our speakers, pointed out convincingly that texts now painted above the windows are clearly meant to go with the subjects represented in stained glass. This enables one to identify the iconography of each window. As pointed out by Miley, the 3 windows in the apse are doctrinal. The descent of the Holy Ghost in the round window in the center refers to the doctrine of the incarnation, that is, Jesus is truly God and truly man. And the angel's words to Mary at the Annunciation, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born of you will be called the Son of God. Showing, surprisingly, however, the scene of the Annunciation is lacking. The window on the left depicts the Immaculate Conception, the doctrine that Mary, by a special grace, was herself conceived without sin, because she was to become the mother of Christ. It shows St. John the Divine writing the book of Revelations, chapter 12, in which he has a vision of a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon at her feet and a crown of 12 stars, which was the traditional way of depicting the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And recently, Janie Anderson explained all that. The double-light windows on either side of the chapel are to be read with respect to their iconography from the left of the altar to the entrance to the chapel, and then from the entrance towards the altar on the right. This wraparound effect has from early medieval times been common in cycles of biblical narratives, as pointed out by Marilyn Laban. The sequence most often started on the left and moved in an anti-clockwise direction, as at St. Francis's, but we'll find that it does it the other way at Immaculate Conception Hawthorne. In the Lady Chapel, the stained glass windows portray, first of all, the presentation of the Virgin in the temple, Mary as a child giving herself, dedicating herself to God. The second window shows her betrothal or marriage to Joseph, which took place in those days in two parts, both very important. And in the third window, which I'll concentrate a little bit more on, is the birth of Jesus. And we see under the Star of Bethlehem, we have Mary kneeling in adoration of the Christ child, who is seated in the manger with sheaves of wheat underneath him, which is a sort of, I think, a Eucharistic symbol. And the manger, of course, is where the ox and the ass would eat, and the wheat would be made into the communion bread, and then we would eat too. So it's sort of very symbolic. Whereas St. Joseph is on the right-hand side underneath an angel who is pointing to the Christ child. In the other side of the chapel, there are also 3 figures, beginning with the presentation of Christ in the temple. In the right opening of the window, Simeon holds the child, while on the left, Mary stands beside a maid holding a candle, linking the image of the church's liturgy for the feast of the presentation to the purification of Mary, and also to the liturgy that is now called Candlemas, because candles are given out to the congregation and lit during the Mass on the 2nd of February. The text above the window is, Simeon said to Mary, thy soul a sword shall pierce, a prediction of Mary's sufferings. The next window represents the flight into Egypt, where we have Joseph striding ahead and Mary on the donkey with the baby Jesus. And ahead of Joseph is up above, there is a statue on a column that is falling down, which is an image taken from the apocryphal gospel saying that as the Holy Family came into Egypt, the idols of Egypt fell. The final window in this side is the crucifixion, which is very close to the apse. And here you see Mary and St. John at the foot of the cross. This reference is to John chapter 19, 26 to 27, where Jesus gives the beloved disciple to Mary as her son and gives Mary to John as his mother. Traditionally, this is seen as a time when Mary became the mother of the church. The text above the window says, "Is there any sorrow like unto my sorrow?" taken from the Book of Lamentations. From the texts above the windows, it becomes clear that we have on the left of the chapel, we have the joys of Mary, and on the right of the chapel, the sorrows of Mary, which is a way sometimes that the stories, the biblical stories connected with the Virgin Mary were portrayed. From 1869 onwards, the Jesuits built the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Hawthorne. The aisles were decorated in 1870 to 71 with a cycle of stained glass windows attributed to the local Melbourne firm of Ferguson and Urey. In this case, there are 4 windows on either side of the aisles. Well, in the aisle, sorry, they're double lighted. And so the cycle starts from the right of the altar, moves clockwise direction, and ends at the left of the altar. The first image is the Annunciation, which was missing in the other cycle. And we can see the descent of the Holy Spirit up at the top in the tracery. And then we have an image of the angel Gabriel coming to declare to Mary that she's blessed among women and that she's called to be the mother of God. And quite interestingly, this image is taken from the view of a famous painting by Fra Angelico in the convent of St. Marco in Florence, which shows that in the 19th century, artists often copied earlier old masters and were particularly interested in Renaissance paintings. And I got this from Alison Inglis. And I also want to note that the colors that Mary wears in the window are different from the ones in the painting, and they follow the prescriptions of Mrs. Jamieson, who is somebody who wrote a lot about iconography in the 19th century. And Jane Jansenson has pointed out that Bishop Gould had a copy of her work. The betrothal of the Virgin comes with to Joseph, comes with the in one light, comes with the visitation in the other light. And underneath, there are the coat of arms of the Honourable John O'Shannessy, who had been Premier of Victoria 3 times, his wife Margaret, and asked for prayers for their family. Next window is again, we're back to the Nativity. We have the Adoration of the Magi, and the windows given by Michael O'Grady, who also asked for prayers for his family. On the other side of the church, we start with the flight into Egypt. So we're getting into the sorrows of Mary, and we have Joseph pointing towards the pyramids, indicating the destination. Mary on the donkey with the child Jesus following behind, and then in the base of the window, there's a poem, which is actually a hymn. It's a version of Mary, Dearest Mother, which is a famous hymn by Frederick Faber, showing popular devotion to the Virgin in this church and parish. There are also several scenes of the Passion of Christ, where we see on one side, Mary greeting her son as he carries the cross to Calvary. Then we see John and Mary at the foot of the cross. And this is given by William Henry Archer, whose coat of arms is at the bottom. And of your charity, pray for William Henry Archer and his relatives, living and dead. And then finally, we have what looks like a pietà. It's actually a deposition of Christ from the cross. Now the dead body on the lap of his mother, as in the pietà, and then the burial of Christ. So again, one could say what we have here, a series of images showing the joys of Mary and the sorrows of Mary. And then in the chancel of the church, there are three beautiful windows which were made by Melbourne artists. First of all, the Annunciation, which is represented a second time here in a version by the Brooks, Robertson and Co. Melbourne. Image we've seen already, the Assumption by William Montgomery. And then there is the name of the church, Immaculate Conception. There's a scene of the Immaculate Conception, Mary flanked by two Jesuit saints, St. Stanislaus Kostka and St. John Berchmans. As mentioned before, the image of the Immaculate Conception was often used to show, took over the idea of the woman clothed with the sun and standing on the moon and a crown of stars around it. There are not so many stars here, but what is very clear is that the artist has followed the Spanish artist Murillo and is again copying the old masters. Now, I've shown that there are many people ask people to pray for them and for their families. And here we have an example which is quite poignant, where there's in another part of the church, Mr. and Mrs. Terence Mahoney asked for, put up the side on the right, which is St. Paul, in memory of their son Anthony, who died at Gallipoli in May 1915. In another part of the church, we come across another view of the Holy Family of Mary and Jesus seated with Joseph standing beside them, the Star of Bethlehem, and the coming of the wise men on the left and the shepherds on the right. And this window was put up much later in 1961 by Richard King, who had worked in the Harry Clark Studios in Dublin. It's in a different style of art, but I thought I should include it because of the inscriptions around it. One says that this was erected in memory of Joseph Charles Westhoven by his widow. But then below that, there is another inscription of a more general nature saying, this western transept has been erected as the Holy Family War Memorial Shrine in memory of those members of Hawthorne families who gave their lives for their country in war. So we're coming into a new subject, which is being put into stained glass at this time in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think I put it in especially because I thought it might relate to the next paper. But what we see on the side of the transept, and I'm afraid it's my slide, which is not such a good photograph, but you can see that there's a double light window with the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child on the left, and the artist's signature down below, his name and so forth is there. And on the right, there is an image of an angel holding up the word Pax, which means peace, of course. And in front of him are lots and lots and lots of white crosses indicating a war cemetery. And so, if I might say so, what we find in these this particular set of windows, we find that we find the imagery is new and takes into account the tragic effects of war, and it promotes prayers for peace. So just to summarize and conclude, the stained glass windows decorating the Lady Chapel of St. Francis and the Immaculate Conception Church in Hawthorne give one a spiritual and significant message, whether it's a biblical message, a message about the history of salvation and church doctrine, a message of people wanting to pray for their families and their loved ones, particularly those who have died, and then a new set of prayers for people who died at war, died for their country, but we want them to be at peace and to promote peace. Thanks. Okay. I'd like now to introduce Susan Kellett, who's going to give the next paper. And if Susan, if you could put your PowerPoint up and share it with everybody as I do this, it would be helpful. So Susan Kellett is a historian whose doctoral thesis examined the image of the Australian Army nurse in the commemorative stained glass windows of World War I and World War II. She currently works as RSL Queensland's senior manager, well-being person. And she continues to research Napier Waller and the RSL in Queensland in her spare time. She is going to talk to us about Waller's War, spirituality, and the Hall of Memory.
Thank you, Joan. Can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yes, you're fine,
Yes.
Susan.
Excellent. Thank you, Joan. That was fascinating.
Susan, can you unmute? We can't hear you.
Yep, it's unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Bottom left.
Bottom left. Okay.
No, it should be lower down, the very bottom of the, very bottom, yes, very bottom of the Zoom screen.
No, it's up the top. I've got mute, but the mute is...
Can you get the Michael Hughes or whatever?
Okay.
I can hear.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
All
right.
I can hear you, but I don't know that. I'm not sure that
The others can.
Oh yes, it's.
Can you hear me, guys? Yep.
Well,
all right.
You go. Michael
right.
says it's working there too. So
All right.
something wrong at Melbourne Uni. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. And Joan, thank you for that fascinating presentation. And certainly there is a lot of what you presented that will obviously flow into my presentation. So I'm talking about Waller's War and spirituality in the Hall of Memory of the Australian War Memorial. Now, stained glass constituted many memorial forms adopted during and after World War I, as families and congregations sought solace in images of Christ or his warrior saints to represent the memory of fallen soldier sons. In churches across the nation, military loss became equated with the Christian crusade, and in some cases, as can be seen here in Scone, New South Wales, the crucifixion, resurrection or ascension represented a serviceman's sacrifice for his country as akin to that of Christ's for mankind. After the war, the appearance of the soldier in stained glass, the secular saint as Bronwyn calls him, transformed the digger to patron saint of the Australian Imperial Force, a national martyr in a country devoid of its own hagiographic tradition. In Canberra, at the Australian War Memorial, the artist commissioned to design and execute its Hall of Memory scheme of glass, AIF veteran M. Napier Waller, wove profound Christian symbolism through his 15 lights with such proficiency that it remained undetected for nearly 7 decades. Holding the deep-seated belief that art, quote, should convey something of the artist's own personal social philosophy of human ideals and a belief in the permanency of our traditions, unquote, Waller drew on medieval custom to represent the sacrifice of Australian servicemen and nurses with the most significant events in the New Testament, Christ's crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. In doing so, he averted Charles Bean's demand that the hall's purpose was secular. In 1915, and after completing his studies at the National Gallery Art School, Melbourne, Napier Waller enlisted in the AIF. He served in the artillery as a bombardier, and following the amputation of his right arm in a hospital on the Western Front in May 1917, he taught himself to write and draw again using his left hand. Waller's rehabilitation coincided with the rise of the Art Deco aesthetic, and the Victorian capital embraced its application to urban and interior design with enthusiasm. The artist soon began executing murals for religious, commercial, and public spaces around the city and dabbling in stained glass. In 1929, Waller and his artist wife Christian travelled abroad to gain experience in Europe. Touring Britain, France, and Italy, the couple were interested in how the medieval arts of stained glass and mosaic could be applied to a modernist context. Waller admitted to being particularly attracted to the windows of the early Middle Ages. Within Europe's cathedrals, the Wallers observed figurative windows in which space and subject matter were divided to form elements of a cohesive narrative. In an age typified by the oral tradition, such windows represented a visual aid to the message of Christianity. While in London, the Wallers visited the studio of Veronica Wall, where they built upon earlier experience gained working with Melbourne stained glass artist William Montgomery. Wall's father, Christopher, was a proponent of the British arts and crafts movement. He and William Morris, one of the better known leaders of the movement, helped revolutionise stained glass design in the 19th century by shrugging off the slavish copying of medieval windows. Waller adopted the ideologies of the arts and crafts movement and, like Morris, believed that an artist's social responsibility should be implicit in his work. Following his return from Europe in 1930, and frequently in collaboration with Christian, Waller quickly extended his reputation as an architectural artist of note. Mosaics for the University of Western Australia and this glorious first floor facade of Newspaper House in Collins Street, Melbourne, along with important windows for the University of Melbourne and Wesley Church, Lonsdale Street, Melbourne, demonstrated his talent. Director of the National Gallery Art School and Waller's former art master, Bernard Hall, remained an influential mentor and was basically part of how Waller was offered the commission for the Hall of Memory. Hall was a member of the Memorial's first art committee and well placed to recommend Waller when the Memorial's second director, John Treloar, began seriously considering stained glass as an element for the Hall of Memory in the 1920s. In December 1937, Waller was commissioned to design and execute the artistic elements in the commemorative space. Waller did not find the War Memorial an easy patron to work with. Charles Bean was adamant that the hall reflect realism, quote, plain, simple, realistic figures of, say, an infantryman and a light horseman, unquote, rather the symbolic approach that Waller desired. Treloar, however, supported his artist and worked quietly with both Waller and sculptor Leslie Bowles to gently subvert Bean's mandate. Ken Inglis observes that decoding the symbolism inherent in Waller's work is not always as easy as recognised in the imagery depicted within it. Like Bean, Waller perceived the responsibility of commemorating the nation's war dead as a sacred duty, but he did not share Bean's belief that the Hall of Memory should be a secular space and that Christian iconography could not satisfactorily express the loss of men. From the moment that he and Bowles submitted their artist's brief in early 1939, Waller described the cathedral-like atmosphere he planned to impart in the Hall of Memory. By metaphorically associating secular with religious, he drew inspiration from the cruciform footprint of the Australian War Memorial and combined it with the ancestry of his oeuvre. Waller created 3 figurative windows that, like those he had observed in Europe, told a story. The artist modernised the practices of medieval design to create a visual account of Australia's experience during the war. The east and west windows relate directly to the eastern and western campaigns fought by the AIF. They contain relevant figures and architecture and are crowned by the symbol under which the AIF was united, the rising sun. In the south and beneath the Aurora Australis and Southern Cross, all citizens who contributed to the war effort stand tall. And here in this image, you see man and woman as nurse, soldier and sailor, and officer and enlisted man. For Waller, a man who had experienced not only war, but also the significant personal sacrifice it demanded, plain, simple, realistic figures of an infantryman or light horseman that Bean desired were never going to suffice. The story Waller was compelled to tell needed to be aligned with greater symbolic and spiritual meaning, and so he turned to the enduring tradition or ritual of Christianity. He knew that the audience would see in the glass what they believed was there if it was close enough to the original description not to arouse suspicion. His subterfuge was so successful that it went unnoticed for nearly 7 decades. In September 1950, and with the windows installed, the artist provided Treloar with a handwritten description of the scheme, and in it, he defined the pelican feeding her young from her bleeding breast as the symbol for charity. And it continues to be described as such to this day by the memorial. Now, charity is, along with faith and hope, one of the 7 feminine virtues, and this provided a convenient attribute for the nurse devotion. Visually, the bird surrendering its blood to feed its young represented a nurse willingly sacrificing her life for those in her care. However, charity only assumed the form of the pelican during the Renaissance. During medieval times, the bird was best known as the Christian symbol for Christ, with the pelican feeding its chicks her blood, serving as a metaphor for his crucifixion. In this 1939 study for the south window, Waller strategically omitted the bird's halo, the definitive sign of Christ's holiness, as he did not want to arouse suspicion with an overtly religious device. Work on the window stalled during World War I, but when it recommenced in 1947, the feminine relationship between the symbolism of charity and the army nurse was well established in the minds of Bean and the other men creating the memorial, so that the addition of a halo to the bird in the window's cartoon and then window escaped notice or comment. Pelican in her piety is sometimes shown resting upon the cross. Like her 14 male colleagues, the nurse stands upon a stone plinth with her back to the column. Those the men stand before generally suggest the streamlined muzzles, barrels, hilts, and handles of armaments and arms, which, once past the symbols above each figure's head, taper up into the transoms above. Devotions does not. The nurse's column, while likewise rectilinear in form, maintains consistency and shape until after the nesting pelican in the lunette. Hers is the only light in which this occurs. And rather than the industrialized Art Deco impression of metal, a central core filled with eucalyptus leaves and gum nuts insinuates the organic form of wood. You can only see that a little bit above the top of the red cross in this image. Now, Waller's placement of lead lines suggests the crossbar of a Latin cross emerging from the body of the red cross, with the pelican and her young nesting upon the Australian arms atop an allegorical cross. Waller symbolised not only Christ's, but also Australia's redemption through self-sacrifice. Now, 2 years prior to this, Waller accepted a commission for the Hall. Before he accepted the commission for the Hall of Memory, he executed the Pioneers window for the Wesley Church, Lonsdale Street, Melbourne. And high in the apex of the tracery, he depicted the Pelican Charity. Barring minor differences imposed by the spatial limitations of a quatrefoil and the artist's modernist approach, this is the same bird that ultimately found a home above devotion over a decade later. Now, as a professional artist, Waller did not adapt his cartoons from window to save time and financially benefit his studio, as trade firms frequently did. His windows were original works of art, so recycling the image of charity for the Hall of Memory was completely irregular. Waller was aware of the impending commission with the memorial when he executed this window in celebration of a century of Methodism in Victoria, and there may have been a personal dimension to his actions. Waller declared himself Methodist on his AIF enlistment. Now, it's unlikely he was making a sectarian statement, and more probable that he was covertly establishing a direct association with Christian symbolism in the upcoming Hall of Memory windows. The pelican, it's handy to know, was also referenced in his initial 1937 plans that never progressed past the conceptual stage. And like the medieval artist, Waller was reusing his subject matter in this case. The west window signifies the resurrection. In the central light of its transom stands a lion astride a golden crown above the figure patriotism. Together, they have been interpreted as alluding to Australia's relationship with its imperial forebear. However, Waller described the quality patriotism as representing the love and urge for country, and he stressed love of this country. He made no mention of England. It's important to understand, though, that in medieval times, the lion was believed It was believed that lion cubs were born dead and that their sire breathed life into them 3 days later. Potent symbol for Christ's resurrection, the lion also features in the apex of Waller's Pioneers window in Melbourne, and like the pelican, was also part of Waller's initial and unrealised 1937 proposal. So we get to the east window, and its central transom, an eagle alights on the column above the light horseman Audacity. Between the bird's wingspan, Waller placed 6 arrowheads ascending. In medieval art, the eagle is symbolic of not only St. John, but also Christ's ascension. It is the third and final element in the apex of the Pioneers window. Crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, pelican, lion, and eagle. Waller created a scheme of religious glass while accommodating and subverting Bean's mandate for realism on a monumental scale. But the veteran artist was not yet finished. Layering meaning upon meaning, he continued to apply the principles of his more medieval forebears to his art. Waller used the men creating the hall, Bean, Treloar, Gullet, Bowles and himself as the models for the figures of control, coolness, endurance, candour and chivalry, respectively. The artist followed the medieval ages tradition of depicting founders of religious houses in the windows of the buildings that they established, and he assigned patronal identities of soldier saints to some of them. Endurance in the east window appears shirtless and holding a fractured and bloody tipped bayonet, which he appears to have withdrawn from a wound located in his right thorax. With more bayonets insinuated upon his uniform or speeding towards him from the sky, he appears as a contemporary Saint Sebastian, the soldier saint and Christian martyr slain by arrows. Chivalry is Waller's self-portrait in the west window, and it bears the cross of St. George in the transom above. The artist aligned not only the theatre in which he saw action, the western front, but also his subsequent sacrifice, the loss of his right arm, an artistic resurrection with that of the popular soldier saint. Medieval texts upon which the accounts of George's life are based report that he was brought back to life several times during his earthly existence before God finally granted him martyrdom. However, not all of Waller's saints were servicemen. There was no need to hide the halo of the Virgin Mary standing at the base of the cross upon which her son died. The nurse's veil conveniently substituted as a nimbus, and the snowy towel fanning from devotion's fingertips signified not only the hygiene practices actively undertaken by nurses, but also the symbol of purity associated with Christ's mother. Despite her intent to engage in clinical work, devotion lacks the apron worn by members of the Australian Army Nursing Service when providing patient care. This instead of Australian Army Nursing Service grey, Waller dressed her to harmonise with the rest of the figures in the scheme, and this facilitated his use of the colour blue, a colour employed in Western art for centuries to signify the identity of the Virgin Mary. Analysis of the windows of the Hall of Memory reveals that the central tenet of Christianity, Christ's sacrifice, is embedded deeply within them, and this contests the belief that the Hall of Memory is in fact a secular space. For Napier Waller, experience, ideology and art were indivisible, making the ultimate sacrifice to war, his ability to create, the ascendant narrative of Australia's commemorative practices, and those who enforced them held no sway in Waller's memory of war. Uncompromising in his beliefs, Waller accommodated his patron's desire for plain, simple, realistic figures of, say, I don't know, an infantry and a light horseman, but he also drew upon his principles to create a complex and symbolic narrative in glass. By allegorising religious sacrifice with personal and national loss, Waller contested the agency of the establishment and subverted its commemorative agenda. While Australia remembrance practices evolved to privilege the Anzac warrior above all others, Napier Waller used Christianity to assign deeply esoteric meaning to the experience of a nation and its people at war. Thank you. Sorry, I'm at work at the moment. I don't have the program in front of me. So Bronwyn, could you please introduce Carolyn's paper on Christian, please?
So Alison, are you not there?
No, I'm here.
You're there? And is Joan there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
Yes, righto. You can take it all back now.
And Sue, you just need to exit the
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, and there. Thank you. Sorry, thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was very good.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it very much. We now have a talk by Caroline Miley, who has had a lifetime interest in decorative arts, especially stained glass. She was lecturer in art history and theory at the Victorian College of the Arts, University of Melbourne, and curator of the college collection. She consults for heritage architects and has published a number of pioneering works on the arts and crafts movement in Australia and related subjects. The Arts Among the Handicrafts, the Arts and Crafts Movement in Victoria, 1889 to 1929, Beautiful and Useful, the Arts and Crafts Movement in Tasmania, and a special booklet on Trinity College Chapel and Appreciation, as well as she also is into social criticism and literary historical fiction, and we look forward very much to hearing her paper. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barclay-Lloyd, and Thank you, Sir Kellett, for that fascinating paper. Christian, of course, Napier's wife, and very much an artist in her own right. I'm going to focus today on a single window by Christian, or in fact a three light, a strikingly beautiful and doctrinally subtle work. It's a rare and significant exposition of theosophical doctrine in stained glass. I'm going to start off by reading the windows as a Christian tract, in which we would say that, for example, the rainbow is the emblem of God's covenant with his people. The imagery of the penitence window on the left is drawn from the penitential Psalms, especially Psalm 56, "Thou tellest my wanderings, put thou my tears in thy bottle." The pale brilliance of the central pardon window represents the light outpoured by the Spirit of God on the penitent soul, while the band of flying birds symbolizes the happiness of the pardoned one. The peace window on the right conflates a series of symbols, while its rich color indicates the happy condition of the soul at peace. In the Egyptian mysteries, the lotus emerging white from the mud symbolizes the eminency of the divine over the material, used here to suggest the soul redeemed from sin. The flowers, which are scarlet in the left-hand window, are white as snow in the final panel. The lantern is the word of God which lights the path, while the eagle refers to the text, "Those who trust in the Lord will rise up as eagles." The use exclusively of female figures is an expression of Christian self-image at this period, as well as her interest in women as the location of spirituality. Well, Christian was fascinated by theosophy, which he became involved in the early 1920s, and which permeated her life and her art. In her case, it was a personal faith synthesized with Christianity and esoteric and conventional beliefs, very much influenced by the Irish dramatist George Russell, who she met on her 1929 European trip, when she also spent time at the Tower of Glass Arts and Crafts studio. Like Russell and other theosophers, she probably saw Christ as a world master, an avatar of the seventh initiation, like Krishna or Maitreya Buddha. Well, theosophy is a syncretic belief system that draws heavily on Indian teachings and synthesizes them with elements from other cultures. It is above all a mystical and occult faith that claims to embrace all religions as being aspects of the continual search for spiritual perfection, in which humans are assisted by a spiritual hierarchy. It resonated with many artists of the period and was an important influence on the development of modernism, especially among both symbolists and early abstract painters such as Kandinsky, Kupka, and Piet Mondrian. Among the elements artists drew from it were the concept of the anima mundi, the world soul, the spiritual essence distinct from matter and supposed in the philosophy of Pythagoras and Plato to be diffused throughout the universe, organizing and acting through the whole of it. There were also certain motifs, colors and forms, and Besant and Ledbetter's Thought Forms of 1901 detailed the results of clairvoyant experiments. They stated that thoughts and emotions create distinctive patterns of color and form in the human aura, visible only to those who are sufficiently clairvoyantly gifted. Well, Waller's figures, as we see to some extent here, are but even more in some of these works. are often surrounded, especially around and above the head, by variously coloured sweeping bands, which might be read as a depiction of the thought forms of figures transformed by spiritual enlightenment. Most artists might see these aesthetic choices based on purely visual factors, but theosophists would regard such tropes as instances in which artists, although unaware perhaps, were carrying out the directions, the unseen spiritual direction of the masters. Despite the colossal influence, programmatically theosophical art is rare. Christian's oeuvre is only equalled in respect of her output, one of which I'm looking at today, by a small number of mainly Scandinavian artists such as Hilma af Klint, Ilona Harima and Einar Jonsson, and she was the sole Antipodean practitioner of this genre. Like the symbolists, Wallace saw art as the intersection between the spiritual and the material worlds and favoured the evolution of personal symbols, rejecting standard iconographies that are so common in stained glass. Her spirituality was transcendental rather than immanent or incarnational. She saw the meaning of life as being in another worldly sphere, inward, mystical, esoteric. Martin Harrison's comparison of Burne-Jones with the French symbolists of the Salon Rose-Foy could have been written about Waller, who saw art as a religious activity. Like them, Burne-Jones accepted myths as archetypal with contemporary relevance. He too applied a paganizing force to Christianity and vice versa. For him, the personal had universal significance. He saw the artist as a medium through which divine revelation passed, and the art object as the symbol and manifestation of it. Very acute remark. Well, just looking briefly here at a couple of critical motifs in Christian's work that bear on the triptych that we'll get back to. One of them is what I'm calling the gazing into spiritual realms motif. One sees many of these in her work, whoever the subject is, and very unusually for stained glass, particularly religious stained glass, the figures look out of the panel. They don't address the viewer at all. They ignore the viewer. Their chins are raised, their eyes gaze upwards to the unseen realms of glory, the ethereal world of the spiritual masters, which in itself irradiates them, as you see, particularly in the beautiful angel window. Another subject that's very relevant and was also a motif of hers very much is that of the descent of the spirit. The right-hand image is in fact titled The Descent of the Spirit of God, although after you've been looking at it for a few moments, you grasp that it's actually the baptism of Christ. And the one on the left is a very unusual subject of Peter's sermon on the morning of Pentecost. That of the right, part of the Good Shepherd window at Macedon, unfortunately destroyed in the bushfires. And you can see the pose here is the pose of the central figure in the Puran triptych. It is a pose of the quiet receptivity of divine spirituality. Well, let's get back to Puran. You see these tropes demonstrated in this window. But before we can make a further, more in-depth analysis of these windows, we need to look at Piet Mondrian. This fabulous triptych of evolution that he did in 1910-11 his most pronounced theosophical work, again, a rare instance of explicitly theosophical doctrine, very well known. And how important this subject was to Mondrian, we can have a look. I've included the curator here doing a light check, simply to demonstrate the scale of these really quite enormous over life-size panels. And back to the non-curator panels. These, it's necessary to look at these in order to understand the Paran windows, I think. According to Madame Blavatsky in Isis Unveiled, a book of which Christian certainly had a copy, every individual has a mental and an astral body as well as the less important physical body. This concept was earlier outlined by Plato, among others, who listed the terrestrial, that is brute, material, physical body, the astral, or the spirit of the stars, that is the soul, and the divine spirit as all not personalities, but worlds that actuate the human person. This doctrine is central to theosophical teaching. Evolution depicts these three aspects of one person, hence the resemblance of the female figures. And the title evolution refers to the basic theosophical doctrine of how the world functions, in which the spirit is the active force on the passive physical world. Mondrian's figures inhabit an occult metaphysical world outside the limits of time and space. The blue and yellow colours suggest the astral world or the anima mundi, while the central, we note, raised figure is surrounded by a pale, intense aura representing the distillation of the divine motivating force of the cosmos. This is the divine, spiritual, creative essence itself. Well, let's have a look at the Paran window again, but now as a theosophical document, and I've taken a liberty by raising up the central panel to match the Mondrian. The program represents the ascending phases of a theosophical spiritual journey, identical to that depicted by Pete Mondrian in Evolution. The figure on the left is terrestrial or physical, the central figure is spiritual, and that on the right is astral or sidereal, as we see by the stars that it inhabits. The terrestrial or impermanent physical human on the left is surrounded by emblems of materiality, including the red snake and flower, although a spring of water is also present. This figure, as somnolent as Mondrian's, clasps to herself a dark brown urn, instantly recognizable by reference to Leadbeater's thought forms as indicating the negative emotions associated with the material being. The astral figure on the right is a subtle body posited by many philosophers as intermediate between the intelligent soul and the mental body. The soul's journey or ascent is described as an ecstatic, mystical, out-of-body experience. The astral figure here is pure and, as a voyager, carries a staff for the journey, a light for the world, and exists in a universe of stars. The astral body moves swiftly in flight like an eagle, which represents the mental body or mind, and the coloration is rich and complex. As with the Mondrian, this triptych is not to be read from left to right. It actually is to be read left, right, centre. And the central figure, the pure white-robed figure, is godlike, motionless, a divinely infused being, poised against a ladder of ascent, stretching upwards to the highest cause, the spiritual light. The stance of this figure, although far less abstracted, resembles that of Mondrian's central figure, and like his, has eyes wide open, gazing not at the world, but at ethereal spaces. It's also the only one that faces frontally. The rest of the window is filled with dynamic energy. A triangular form reaches upwards while the whole panel moves from darker at the base to lighter at the top. One of the many instances in which Christian uses this trope to denote spiritual progress. A mandorla of rose-coloured birds surrounds her, arching across a rainbow. Her head is surrounded by a blaze of swirling pale flames of clear pinks and ambers around a radiant column descending from and uniting her with the divine realm. Her mental aura, undoubtedly, filled with a colour denoting unselfish affection. This triptych is a spiritual object of the highest degree, radiating its pure light into the world, beautifying it and raising it to greater spirituality. To conclude, I'm going to speak briefly about the concept of the agency of the object, highly relevant here. Works of art and craft, even machines or natural objects, are often endowed with the capacity to act on the world, and this capacity is given to them by the people who make them and use them. Any artwork is intended to and does have some sort of effect on the viewer. But for theosophists, agency meant far more than this. It far transcended the use of symbols. This is the single most significant idea that Christian derived from theosophy. The Society proposed a paradigm of the agency of the object where the visible represents only a partial reality and where the invisible has real and routine impact on the visible world. A theosophical work was conceived as drawing in and containing within itself a specific spiritual force which it concentrated like a dynamo or like a power station and disseminated to all who came within its range. Christian's windows are intended as objects of spiritual power which would act upon all who saw them, hence agents in the transformation of Australia into a more spiritualised society, the theosophical agenda. Her work, therefore, was not merely decorative or even symbolic, but of the highest importance as an active agent in transmitting the divine into the world she lived in. Nothing could be more important than the creation of such channels or the role of the artist who made them. As a theosophical artist then, rare, I think even unique in Australia, Christian Waller's role was to make the invisible visible, to visualise the divine, to create works which would transmit the power of the all into the world, and in doing so, to make it more beautiful and spiritual. What better medium could she have chosen than glass, which both harnesses and transmits light, and which is composed of colour and light? The images she created tell part of the story she wished to convey. Single figures, faces turned upward towards a light whose source is beyond the frame, receptive of the divine rays which stream onto them. But these images and their enticing beauty, while they portray spiritual experience, were for her only the husk of the real invisible message they radiate and which is to be felt rather than seen. And just a couple of close-ups. The beauty of her drawing and technique is magnificent. And much more about Christian in the book and on the webpage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you for a very fascinating paper. And thank you also, Susan, for a wonderful paper. I'm not sure we have time. We've got 5 minutes for any questions discussion. I don't know if anybody would like to put a question on the chat. Just beautiful paper. Thank you so much for sharing. Yes. Yes, yes. And well, I think it would be very interesting. And I want to thank both Susan and Caroline for wonderful papers, and it's just been a pleasure to be here, although it was a bit strange at the beginning.
Yes.
but we got over that. So, and thank you to the organisers of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you to my co-presenters for fascinating papers. I learned a lot, Carolyn, in relation to Christian, who fascinates me as much as Napier.
It was good to see you.
It's good to see the contrast between the two of them.
Yes, and I suppose I'll just make a comment that I'm very aware that there was a lot of collaboration that Christian contributed to that goes unrecognised in Napier's art, and that probably had a lot to do with the gender, the culture in relation to gender at the time. But certainly a number of my works that I study and research, I can very much see her influence in him.
Yes, that's yes. I'm glad that's your opinion as well. And in the book, I've tried to attribute collaborations where I'm sure of them. She signed a great deal of her glass, unlike Napier.
Yes, yeah. I
Yes,
think.
Go on.
I was going to say, I think Napier was relying on his reputation.
Yes, perhaps. Of course, as we say, Christian was a very sophisticated theologian of her own unique, idiosyncratic spirituality. I very much read in these areas and much more sophisticated than I at first realised. Napier was a Methodist, as you say. That's what he wrote on his call-up papers. They were married, I think, according to Methodist rites. And I don't think he shared Christian's occult and hermetic spirituality at all.
He references her in The South Window. It's not figuratively. Of course, devotion is Lorna, the woman he was having a relationship with at the time, and subsequently married after Christian's death. But yeah, he does reference Christian in relation to her theosophical beliefs in the top transom, and it has to do with one of the pieces of one of the figures in the window. So yeah, that's a story for another day.
Oh, I must make more of that. Yes, well, a very interesting artist in his own right, and the contrast between the two of them is educational. It's instructive.
Yeah, and I actually think that after her death, his work never reached the heights that it was when he would, she was alive and collaborating with him. I just think it lost a spark once she died.
Oh, well, I'm very interested to hear you say that, because I'm partisan, been working on someone for 10 years and immersing yourself in them, you sort of begin to, but that's my impression as well. And unlike the mural work and accepting the war memorial glass, the bulk of Napier's glass was done after Christian's death, I think, although a complete chronology is not yet available. And I'm interested to hear you say that, because that's my impression as well. He really was so original. I've tried to construct what I hope is a reasonably faithful impression of her as a person. Been fairly hard to get on with at times, I would imagine. like quite a lot of artists, it is unfortunate about the second Mrs. Waller. But yes.
That would make a good 1920s whodunit, the second Mrs. Waller.
Apparently she had a fine collection of hats, of some of which are in the Museum of Victoria.
Yes, yeah. I got to admit, I always one of my favourite books was Rebecca, and I always wonder whether Lorna's relationship after Christian's passing and her marriage to Napier, I often wonder whether there was a degree of the whole thing that was going on in Rebecca with the first wife overshadowing the second.
Well, Lorna certainly did her best to avoid that happening by expunging the traces of the second Mrs. Waller as far as possible, which has certainly made life more difficult for anyone who happened to think they might write a book about Christian.
Of either of them, really, yeah, because we don't have his papers, do we?
Well, hers, no. There's a few things scattered about the place here and there, correspondence with churches and so forth, and bits and pieces. So, in fact, I've been in writing the book and in drawing up the catalogue, I've been obliged to fall back very extensively on the work.
That's wonderful, and it's in a way it's good to have that sort of getting back to the actual work. I'm afraid it's very fascinating, but I think we've come to the time.
Oh yeah, we could talk all day. We've got to go.
It's very nice to see you. I was trained as a Renaissance iconographer and in connoisseurship under Professor Mannion and so on in my distant youth. And so that was a good foundation, which has come in very handy in my later work and in the Christian work. Yes, there's nothing like, I always say, if you look at the work for long enough, it will tell you everything about itself. So
that's good.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you both very much. And we're going to close this now.
Yes, and everyone come back in half an hour. We'll have our sixth session of the day. We'll start at 2:30, which is Glass and First Peoples. So a half-hour break now. Thank you to our very long-suffering chair and the other speakers for this session.
Well, thank you.
thank you.
Nice to meet you at last, Alison.
Yes.
And Caroline. Yeah.